And welcome everyone to this episode of the Inforunners Podcast. And today we are talking about what everyone else has been talking about, the Eclipse, which is such a great vessel. I'm Dasein was here.
And this is Hayes.
And well, we just wanted to say, thank you, CIAG.
Yeah, look, thank you so much for making a single focus ship. The Eclipse is focused solely on its singular role of delivering a payload, which is why it's going to be such a spectacular bomber, not just a stealth bomber. No, it can't do cargo, can't carry smaller missiles, and can't do other roles, but this is the reason it's going to be so great.
Yes, this ship is a single focus ship, and that is why everything about it is so good. It has good size. It has good forward speed. Yes, it's not maneuverable, but it can go fast. Then you have stealth. Oh my, the stealth. You have good torpedo capacity and low crew requirements. So all of this combined is going to make this such a great vessel. That all being said, unlike how CIG has marketed it, we're going to talk about the unsold truth of the Eclipse and how this particular ship is going to make a great carrier-based bomber, not just the first strike vessel that they talked about.
CIG have been trying to sell this as a stealth bomber, doing stealth runs, solo player coming out and popping an Idris all by itself. But notice how they have made every attempt to not talk about carrier-based roles and combat in general, and try to highlight the idea that the Eclipse can't dogfight, it's weak, and it's not very maneuverable, in an attempt to dissuade people from the idea that this bomber would ever see a combat role. Look at them trying to admit the Idris when talking about hangars and which hangars the Eclipse would actually fit in. They missed the most asked and the most obvious answer in the question on purpose. Yet in the jump point, one of the main design directions was to make sure the Eclipse fit in the Aegis hangar. They don't want to market the idea that the Eclipse would ever face off in a direct combat role.
Well, let's just take a second right now and talk about how fleet combat is going to work again in Star Citizen, because we did an episode on this, but a lot of people really need to think about how ships like the Idris, especially, or in the same concepts apply to kind of the Javelin or the Polaris, but really the Idris is the epitome of this. The Idris is not a parking garage. Everyone seems to have this horrible impression that the Idris is this ship that can carry 3, as it was advertised, probably with its size increase, 4 fighters. And when you look at this, you're going to be going, okay, so it carries 3 to 4. Not really. It's going to have a huge rotation of probably up to around 8 fighters cycling through this ship. You're going to have what's in there, refueling, sitting in there. Once the other guys' fuel or ammunition starts running low, they will cycle it out, and there's going to be this continuous cycle. So technically an Idris could carry 8, or even if you're really feeling lucky, you could probably get by with 12 fighters continuously cycling through so they have enough fuel, and you now have this massive force projection on this giant, beautiful rearming platform.
This is where the Eclipse really starts slipping into the equation, because out of, let's say, 8 actual sort of ship rotation, you only need to include 2 Eclipse into that, and suddenly you have the tactical striking power of a single Retaliator, with the single exception that you can literally rearm after every single engagement, as opposed to a Retaliator that has no current rearming options available to itself. And when you compare the idea that, well, when you start looking at, let's say, payloads, if you take a Gladiator on an Idris, it has roughly a third of the payload capacity of a single Eclipse. It has 4 size 5 torpedoes. That's equal to only a single size 9 torpedo. And so to get the same level of sort of force projection, the same load of payload capacity as 2 Eclipse, you literally need to be running 6 Gladiators. Compare that to 2 Eclipse with a dedicated 6 wingmen to be able to escort them, make sure that they get their payload to the target, protect them when they come back and rearm and then go out again. There's not really a comparison there. Eclipse is going to win in that situation hands down, from a payload perspective, from a manpower perspective, from ability to rearm and service those aircraft. This is like the most ideal carrier-based tactical warhead torpedo solution
that's currently out there. And the fact is, the CIG has done something right here. They have now taken, with the introduction of the Eclipse, and again, yes, it does have first strike capability, but keep in mind, after that first strike, it's going to be able to go back, rearm, go back out again, rearm, and just have that beautiful cycle going. And who cares if it's a glass cannon and can't fight? It's going to have fighter escorts with it.
But this is it. It's not going to be a glass cannon. Who cares if it's a glass cannon? Sure, it's not going to take many hits. It's got crap shields. It's not going to be very maneuverable. But that's what your escort wing's entire job is. It's to intercept, keep you safe, and fight off everything that would put you down. I mean, you don't need any guns on you to defend yourself. You don't need to be highly maneuverable, which is not a bad thing, but it's not the end of the world. At the end of the day, those squadrons, which you can afford because you have so much more payload and a single pilot, you can bring more fighters to the game, which is more likely to see you actually get your mission completed.
Well, and let's just look at the role of bomber. The role of bombers now have completely changed. Like I was saying, you now have two types of bombers out there. You now have your heavy bombers, which are going to be dealing with your capital ships, like your Idrises, your Polaris, your Javelins. You're going to have your Retaliator, which is going to be your long-range, huge payload, great defense, being able to get in there, even with its escort fighters, and actually be able to take hits. And then you're going to have this beautiful one, in the Eclipse, which can go in there, either perform stealth roles, and like they've been advertising, or be the ideal anti-capital carrier bomber, which is going to go out there and hit. And then you have your other class, which is basically your mid-size hybrid, like torpedo lights, you might say, in the Harbinger and the Gladiator, which are going to be your missile boats, which are going to be focusing on dealing with enemy fighters and bombers. So they're basically going to be hitting those mid-size vessels and the small-size vessels that are coming towards you. And the other ships are going to be focusing on the larger vessels.
Well, it's like you said, they've unexpectedly created a hybrid-based lower-tier bombing class, which the Gladiator and the Harbinger actually sit in now. And these sorts of ships are going to be focusing on smaller targets like other vanguards, perhaps constellations, but they're not going to have enough hitting force to actually be effective anti-capital ships. And because they sort of are a fighter and they try to hybridize into a bombing role, they sort of don't do either of them anywhere near as good as opposed to a specialist superiority fighter or a specialist bomber, i.e. the Eclipse.
But they still have a very good role, though, because looking at these ships, they're going to be the type of people that protect you from the actual threats, which are going to be your Retaliators and your Eclipses and the other mid-sized vessels, which are actually going to pose a threat to you. So they still have a really good role there. It's just a different role than what everyone originally envisioned it as.
Yeah, the meta has definitely shifted now. It definitely sort of takes them out of the idea that they will be affecting that higher end sort of capital gameplay, and it's sort of shifted more towards a more of a combat sort of role, like you say. But these changes have essentially put the Eclipse as the epitome of what an anti-capital ship carrier bomber should be. It's now the new standard. And as you said, because these Gladiators and these Harbingers are now more of an anti-fighter, anti-sort of medium ship role, I know that the Eclipse, the stealth is great, but the reality is that's not the main thing going for it now.
It really isn't. And with these new roles defined, we're really going to have to look at what type of mixes are we going to be having in our fleets. And it really goes back to the fact that you're saving manpower with the Eclipse. You can have a ton more Eclipse and firepower than you can have with a Retaliator. So the question really is, how good are your fighter squadrons going to be to actually having the extra tankiness versus the extra burst DPS versus being able to bring more fighters along? it's going to be an interesting math to figure out what type of ratios actually work and what is actually the best.
Well, when you think about it, it's got twice the payload capacity as a retaliator and trades that off with range, with the ability to sort of actually land on an Idris and rearm at a station, so it can continually cycle in and out, which is something a retaliator can't do. Once it's actually flung off its payload, there are currently no ships capable of resupplying a retaliator without it actually going back to port.
Well, you do have the Javelin, because the Javelin destroyer should be able to, if I remember right, have a retaliator in it. But outside of that, you can't really have anything smaller.
I think that maybe if that rear hangar ever opens up, but I think they're kind of moving away from that. Now that we've had the reveal and the sort of hangar, I think the Retaliator's been left in the limbo as being a bit too big of a ship to resupply, unfortunately.
They're going to have to change that because it's unwieldy. If they don't allow that to happen, like we were talking about in our Javelin episode, then the Retaliator's not going to have a place, period, because, well, unless you're having port combat, then it just doesn't make sense.
So what we have here is the Eclipse, essentially, because it's low manpower, high payload capacity, ability to rearm. It's sort of changed the entire torpedo sort of meta, you could say. There's been no reason for you to take as many gladiators to match the payload as an Eclipse, as opposed to trading off all the gladiators, getting only a handful of Eclipse and putting the rest into fighter support.
Well, let's talk secondaries, because that's kind of the smoking gun here. No pun intended. There's been a lot of discussion on that, and I was actually thinking, why do they even have secondaries? Why not just put a couple missile pylons there and have a couple missiles to deal with the fighters? That would make a lot of sense, really.
No, I disagree. I mean, if we're going to put a pilot who's crash landed and now he has a handgun as a sort of survival mechanism to make sure he tries to survive the encounter altogether, the 2x2 guns on there actually make a lot of sense. They're never going to be used in a committed fight. That's what your wingman are going to be for. But let's say you're in dire straits and you're desperate and all you have is those two small towed guns. It's better than nothing. At the end of the day, if you only had two Rattlers, you probably already used in your main engagement, and so you've got nothing. But the idea you can put two energy weapons on there and sort of always give you something as a fail-safe, as a last-ditch desperate attempt to sort of get yourself through, it makes a lot of sense.
I can see your point, especially when you take into account if you have 2 or 4 of these particular Eclipses in a fight, that those guns do add up in damage and firepower. So that's a really good point. The other thing that we really should be talking about is the poor Polaris, because during the Q&A, they specifically mentioned that the poor Polaris is not going to be able to fit one of these, and that just made me sad because I was thinking, well, if you think about what we were talking about with fleet combat earlier and the rotation, yes, this hangar fits one vessel, but you're probably going to be able to, especially if you're feeling lucky, go through and cycle in 3 different ships. Having 2 fighters and a single Eclipse with you and your Polaris, that's actually a pretty good force.
It surprised me that they said, oh, no, it's not going to fit in a Polaris hangar, which I think is very in line with their marketing of omitting the Idris question. They don't want Eclipses to sort of go into mainstream battle focuses. They want stealth components, stealth missions. This is their marketing focus. Now, when you look at a Sabre or a Super Hornet, the dimensions are not too far off of the Eclipse. And okay, maybe it is a little bit of a close fit. Personally, I think it's going to fit. But what if it doesn't fit along the length of the ship? It definitely is going to fit if you rotate the craft by 90 degrees. The Polaris hangar is actually very long. It's about 30 meters long and I think 20-something wide. And the Eclipse is actually incredibly short compared to most fighters. So it will fit in the hangar better than most superiority fighters once you rotate that 90 degrees, just due to the nature of the way they've made the hangar. Maybe that means there won't be an auto landing option to go in there. Maybe it means you will not be able to land and take off while the ship is in flight, and you're going to have to come to a full stop. But just the way the ship is designed and the dimensions, people are going to land it in that hangar.
Well, it'll be interesting to see, but either way, this particular ship is such an amazing ship. And again, CIG, thank you very much for making a pure specialist. Guys, what do you think? I mean, are we wrong? Are we right?
And shout out to Utho Riley, who was very kind enough to compose our ambient music for us.
Yes. Utho, thank you very much for that. And again, just going back, thank you very much to our overlay, too. Brand new overlay.
And we love to hear back your comments. We answer and read every single comment. If you have anything to say, please put it down in the box below.
Well, guys, don't forget to like and subscribe. And as always,
catch you around in the verse.
See you around.